from there. Okay, we were talking about the ACLU and so forth.
Yeah, the ACLU was formed not to defend civil liberties, but to undermine the constitutional protections uh, throughout society that allow for free speech. You know, it's a contradiction in terms. You think they would be the first defenders of free speech, but they have worked over the years relentlessly to remove the kinds of things that help preserve a civilized order that permits free speech. Let me give you an example. They worked to undermine decency laws. They've never seen the pornography or obscenity that they don't like. In fact, I remember debating the president of the ACLU at an art center in Delaware, Joe Biden's Delaware. And I remember at a luncheon before the event where I represented Heritage Foundation, uh, the woman, and I forget her name, said
Nadine
that
Strossen.
it wasn't Nadine Strossen this time. It was,
Oh,
and I debated Nadine a couple other times.
she was actually the most conservative head of it. So,
She was, I liked her. She, you know,
yeah.
we talked before and after. She didn't have that bile that a lot of them have. This woman said that one of the people sitting next to her said, "Well, surely the ACLU isn't for child pornography, are they?" And she said, "Well, we oppose the production of it, but not the possession of it." And the woman who had asked the question said, "Really?" And then the ACLU woman smiled and said, "Yeah, but we'll get around to the other." In other words, we don't want any barriers to prevent child pornography in any way, shape, or form. And I remember bringing that up on a firing line with William F. Buckley. I was on and I was debating Nadine
Wow.
Strossen, and I said, I said these people, uh, they say they're for freedom, but they're undermining everything that ensures our freedom. And you have to have a moral order as a foundation, or you can't have freedom. I mean, founders talked about this. That it's a republic if you can keep it, and if a people that is not bound by morality cannot be governed, we can't have a free republic. This is why we can't impose our American values around the world on certain regimes, because the people are not equipped, frankly, to be self-governing. They're used to autocracy. They're used to dictatorships and being directed. They don't automatically become Republicans and Democrats. And yet, you know, that's one of the faults of our elites, I think. During the Bush era in particular, we're going to change the whole world to reflect liberal democracy in America. Well, it just ain't happening, and there's a good reason. The virtues that are inherent in American society due to our Christian heritage and our Jewish heritage uh, aren't apparent there. So why they can't support the kind of freedoms that we take for granted.
So again, I want to come back to the theme of responding with truth and grace. Can you give a couple of more examples where you have been able to respond with truth and grace? Because I liked your baseball example, and turned wrath soft.
Well, I've talked to many activists and debated them, and the sometimes I will confront them if they start the name calling, or they try to tell me what I'm really thinking or standing for. Nobody has to put up with that. They say, "Well, you're just a bigot, Bob." I'll say, "Well, if bigot means," and then I can make my point. You always turn it on them. A good debater will go on the offense and not the defense. Too often, conservatives get very defensive. They don't realize that they're standing on a rock, which is the truth. So they need not get defensive, but they can parry uh, rather nasty attacks by acknowledging them, dismissing them, and then moving on to make their point. I mean, the best debaters do that all the time. And I learned that from some good people who had been in the arena for years. He said, whatever you do, don't repeat the charge. Okay, if they say you're a bigot, you don't say, I'm not a bigot. What you say is something like, well, that's interesting. You should say that because I, here are my values. And then you can project your wholesome, good values without turning around and responding to what they hoped would be an angry response in kind. You know, it was fascinating to watch Donald Trump confront the media. And I think it's because so many uh, conservatives and those who are supposed to be defending traditional values, so called, were always being defensive. They're always backing up. They're always making sure people know I'm not a hater before addressing the point. Well, whenever you repeat their charge in an effort to ward it off, you're basically acceding to their charge. So people shouldn't do that. They should just say, look, that's not the point, and then go right on and tell them what is.
Well, what you're saying sounds very reasonable. But I'm just wondering to what extent the very fact that you seem reasonable is one reason you've been sort of marginalized and no longer appearing on CNN and Fox. In other words, the so-called conservatives who appear, to me, it's sort of like a freak show. Like if I were a liberal casting director trying to put people on who would turn off everyone in the middle, it would be the conservative spokespeople I see on television. And yet you never see the reasonable voices able, as you said, to respond with truth and grace in the mainstream media, for sure. And I'm wondering if it's actually a policy that we want the screamers, we want the haters, we want the extremists to represent these, mainstream views to make people feel, who are in the majority and who are actually quite reasonable and fair-minded, that what they believe is so beyond the pale that it shouldn't be considered, that if it's all part of a propaganda operation. I wonder how you might respond to that.
I'd agree completely. I really would. I think that some of the people I know who are the most effective debaters on any number of issues, you just don't see on these shows that feature other sides. And I think it's because they want the least effective speakers. Let me give you an example. Years ago, I was on the Oprah Winfrey Show.
Wow.
And the topic was gay marriage. Okay. And this is a typical scenario. They had three couples up there, and they all uh, told their stories, and Oprah was listening with rapt attention. And then she went into the audience, and they picked out this one guy who was real heavy Southern accent, and he said, "Well, I just think God made Adam and Eve, not Adam and Steve." And of course, that's a caricature of I agree with him, but it's not the most effective argument. And she got around to me. I was featured, and just to show you how people on the left, and I put Oprah in that category, can't think straight anymore. I said, look, when you take marriage and you validate things that are not really marriage and call it the same and apply the law equally, you're committing consumer fraud. Let me put it another way. Say you have a bottle of wine and a bottle of vinegar, and you label both of them vinegar or both of them wine. So the consumer doesn't know what he's getting. And she suddenly stopped and said, are you calling gays vinegar? I said, no, Oprah, it's an analogy. It's about specificity. We have labels for a reason, so we know what we're getting. When you muddy up the word marriage, you are depriving people of an accurate account of what it really is. And this is just typical, though. And that's all I got to say. And then she moved on to other people. But the responding to things that are utterly absurd, you should probably use a little bit of disarming humor. That's one of the most effective responses. Look at the Babylon Bee. That's the fantastic Christian satire site.
I agree with you. It's very funny, but hasn't it been banned?
No,
in many
well,
outlets?
it was banned. Musk put it back on Twitter. I mean, it took Elon Musk buying Twitter to reinstate it. Probably doesn't fare well on through the Google search engine or on Facebook still, but it has found its audience, and it's deadly in its aim. These guys are first-rate satirists.
I
And
agree with you. I don't even know how they do it. I mean, it reminds me of the
yep,
National Lampoon when it started before it got unfunny. And
yeah, yes,
as I said, the only funny people today I see are Christians, which is interesting because the reputation is that Christians had no sense of humor. But the Babylon Bee, they make videos that are funny, which I do think still are on YouTube, and they make the emails with the fake articles that are very funny. And I watched them interview Musk, which was actually a fascinating interview. And they just seem somehow to be really gifted, and they're funny. And in a real world, they would have a network show because there are a lot of Christians in the country who probably do watch CBS or would if they had the show on. So you have
yep.
to ask, how come Christians in a Christian country are now a oppressed minority?
Because they let the left take over the institutions, from academia to Hollywood to even corporate America. And the left realized that in corporate America's case, they took over the personnel departments. This was very smart because they can impose their set of values and say that they're training people to be more tolerant. And then they bring in their value set, which was at odds with the Judeo-Christian value set. And they say, if you don't go along with this, you're intolerant and you probably won't get far in this company. So it becomes very oppressive. And it is to this day. Many companies are very oppressive and are basically doing the work of left-wing activists.
But isn't some of that because the government plays a role, both the legislative branch and the executive branch and the judicial branch? I mean, a lot of these things are employment law, hostile environment issues.
Well, yeah, they say the law is a teacher. Okay, it's never really neutral. The law is a teacher. It's every law is backed by force, so it has a morality of some sort behind it. And what they've done is replace traditional moral values behind the law with the new morality, which is often relativism, moral and cultural relativism, or outright Marxism, where they prefer a socialist solution to whatever the problem is, and the suppression of alternative views. You know, there's an alien culture that has taken hold in many American institutions that is utterly un-American. And I think it's being outed now. See, this is why I'm not entirely pessimistic. More and more people are upset.
So
They've overreached. They
you
always
think,
do.
but you think it actually responding with truth and grace is the
Hmm.
key to reversing this trend?
Yeah, I do. I think truth is that powerful. I think a little bit of truth is like the stone in David's sling. It can slay Goliaths. It's that powerful. And that's why they have to erect this huge edifice of lies against it. So people should be confident in using the truth. It's the most powerful thing out there. And as far as grace, that stems from a humility that comes from the idea that we're not God. God loves us enough, even with our own imperfections, our sins, our sinful nature. And so, therefore, we can't lord over other people with whom we disagree. So we kind of have to approach them with a ethos of humility, uh, even while being confident in telling the truth. It's not a tough balancing act. As I said earlier, I don't have to pretend not to hate people because I don't hate them. Okay? Here's another anecdote. I was on the Shirley Show in Toronto. That's their version of the Oprah Winfrey Show or any number of talk shows. And the topic was gay parenting. So they did what they always do, which was to have several sets of gay parents. The audience was all gay activists. I mean, really, it was solid, the whole auditorium. And they whipped up their sympathy, etc. And I remember them looking at me with just daggers in their eyes, and they were screaming at me and everything else. And I said to God, I said, Lord, what have you put me here for? I'm trying to represent your moral order. I want to do it with grace and effectiveness. But I don't see it happening here. These people are closed-minded. And he said, and they hate me. Why did you put me here? He says, they don't hate you. They hate me. You're just a stand-in. So don't get puffed up about yourself. It was actually, I felt this incredible divine rebuke. He said, let me love them through you. So I adopted a different countenance. I said, okay, go ahead, Jesus. Love these people. I know you do. I don't right now. They're abusive. I don't like them. You love me through, love them through me. And I started looking at this woman in the front row, and she was, smarmy and looking at me, and I just locked eyes with her, and I said, Jesus, give me your eyes of compassion and love, because you created her and love her, and I can't. So I just looked at her with this look, and she suddenly reacted and put her hand up in her mouth and looked like a really sweet little girl for a minute. And I thought, that's the real her. That's the one God created in his image. And she's been molded in a different way. She's been swept aside by this worldly, perverse culture. And she was looking at me in a different way and everything. And then her friend next to her looked at her, noticed, and started elbowing her and tried to get her back into this abusive mode. And she kind of pretended for a while, but I played a little game with her after that while I was debating these guys. I look over at her and she'd do this. And I just saw this look of recognition, like there's something bigger working here. And it wasn't me. It was that I allowed myself to have the love of God flow toward her. It was that spiritual. Became easy, not for anything I did. And anyway, we went on with the debate and so forth. And I had done a number of these way back when they allowed these issues to be debated. And it would often be a hostile audience. The host would often be hostile, and I'd be portrayed as the stick in the mud who won't go along with the love and inclusion. I knew that was my role, but I didn't react in the way they wanted me to. They wanted me to get angry and judgmental. I didn't need to. I mean, I didn't want to, didn't need to. I just said, gosh, all these people God loves. I'm just going to tell the truth and let the chips fall. And once you surrender to God's point of view and say, you're the boss, I'm not, just use me, it frees you up. You realize you're not going to do it on your own. It gives you great peace, gives you confidence. I've done this before many debates. I've said, Lord, I need help because I know this other person, like Barney Frank. I knew he was sharp as could be. And I said, please give him the light and love you've allowed me to grasp. This is nothing of my own making. It's you. Please afford Congressman Frank that same love and open his heart to you. And I said, and if he rejects you, mess him up a little. I need the help. That was
You
my
know,
prayer.
this reminds me a little of Christians being fed to the lions in the Roman era, and the miracles of or Daniel in the lion's den, and those types of stories. I mean, do you feel persecuted as a Christian in America today?
I feel suppressed. I think persecution's too strong a term because of what people are going through in Africa right now and in many Muslim countries. That's real persecution. They go in and level a village or something. That's uh, there's real persecution going on. I think a milder form of it is happening in this country. I think a lot of Christians have lost uh, opportunities to be greater influences in the culture because they've been suppressed. I think I'm one of them. I think I would have a bigger platform. I'm grateful that I have one in the Washington Times and other places, and on your blog. But I think I would have had a bigger platform had I not tackled certain issues that are now verboten. Um, the people on the left who are doing the cultural issues have managed to create basically a blacklist system where they just won't allow you on anymore. Even Fox News won't allow this issue to be, or this issue, uh, the sex issues, be debated honestly. They've just, they've gone, they've caved. They won't have on effective social conservatives to argue these points. And if they do have them on, they have to stick to the most dry procedural issues possible. And that's another thing. If you're being interviewed and you happen to be defending traditional values at a school board meeting or anywhere else, don't let them sidetrack you with procedural issues. Um, Often they'll allow the other side to give incredibly emotional arguments, pull the heartstrings out arguments, and moral arguments. And then they turn to the conservative and they say, well, where do you think this will go next? Or what do you plan next? Give your heartfelt argument. Match the emotional impact of the other person. Because if you just talk about, well, next Wednesday, we're hoping the judge will do such and such, they say, well, we gave him equal time. The conservative only gets to talk about procedure. The liberal pulls the heartstrings. That wins every time. And that's what's been happening for years, Larry. I mean decades. The liberals always go for the heartfelt argument. They go for victimization. They go for they try to uh, approach everybody as if they're appealing to a stricken mother. And meanwhile, the conservatives are doing dollars and cents and talking about rational ways to approach things. And D.K. Chesterton, the great Catholic writer from Britain, addressed this in one of his books. He said that the uh, if there is a mugging of if there is a slaying of a grandmother in Battersea Park, which is a park in London, I guess, he said, you know what? People will go to great lengths to avoid the moral condemnation of that act because we're so leery of expressing any real moral view at all. We'll say things like, well, that's a waste of a perfectly good grandmother, or or what's it come to when the public can't travel safely in the park, and anything but this is wrong to take the life of a grandmother. So they won't face things because we've been programmed to avoid the moral argument, because the moral argument has been recast as a form of bigotry and suppression and narrow-mindedness. So this isn't new. It's just that the system itself has adopted that. And so when you ask whether Christians are being persecuted, I'd say they're being suppressed. I'll leave it at
Okay.
that.
Let me ask a question about, I live in Florida now. What do you think of what our governor, Ron DeSantis, is doing?
Oh, I think he's doing some marvelous things. I think he's taking on the powers that be. He's basically doing a Trump-like fucking back without the hard edge. Um, I like the fact that he is going on the offense against all sorts of things. I mean, talking about a grand jury investigating how the COVID-19 pandemic was mishandled, what claims were made and whether they were truthful, whether the authorities were lying to us. That takes guts because the entire establishment has backed the narrative that came out of the Trump administration with Anthony Fauci and Deborah Birx, and carried right on through the Biden administration. Only vaccines can cure this whole thing, and that all the alternative treatments are useless or even dangerous, which was a flat out lie fed to us. And then the lockdowns were disastrous. And that's all coming out now. You notice that reports are coming out about excess deaths during lockdown periods, which indicate that two things. COVID may not have been the worst thing to face us at the time. And two, there was so much collateral damage of suicides, drug and alcohol abuse, and delay of life-giving treatments for cancer and all kinds of things, that the excess deaths rose in virtually every state that had a lockdown. Florida had very few, and if you look internationally, Sweden had probably the lowest, and they wouldn't go along with the lockdown.
So, but to get it back to DeSantis,
Okay,
I hope they don't.
DeSantis is
They
tackling
did.
that.
They actually censored one of DeSantis's televised events where he had a panel of doctors talking about this. So they've even censored DeSantis. But why do you think DeSantis has been able to maintain the support of establishment Republicans and the Bush family, as far as I know, as well as Trump supporters? What do you think he does differently that somehow enables him to run both as a mainstream Republican and as sort of a Trump type figure?
I think it's personality. I think he's as conservative as Trump governed, and that therefore he will attract the Trump supporters, but he won't alienate the mainstream Republicans the way some of Trump's folks did. Name calling doesn't help. A lot of people were amused by it, but I think it put off a lot of people, especially the suburban Republican women. They just didn't like it. They don't like that edge. And here's
So you think it's
DeSantis coming
because
along.
Trump was not responding? He may have been responding with truth, but he wasn't responding with grace.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I kept thinking, he's surrounded by all these Christian advisors, supposedly, who were helping him along his spiritual way. But I think Trump has enough of an ego that he didn't want to hear so much the grace message. He thought his truth message, his aggressiveness was the way to go because it got him there in the first place. So I'd like to think he'd learn along the way, and even now might temper his message without tempering his policies.
Well, he's in his 70s. I mean, it's hard to teach an old dog new tricks,
Well, I guess apparently it is. But here's DeSantis coming along, and a bit often, and it's cliche at this point, he's Trump without the Trumpiness. He's the guy who can get things done and talk back to the left and hold them accountable and actually pursue policies that go on the offensive instead of the defensive, which is very refreshing for Republicans. Republicans are always on the defensive. A lot of people are so sick of that they embrace Trump so eagerly, and I was one of them. I was glad he was pushing back so hard. I was glad at his very aggressive policies. He did a great job as president. People should know that by now. But I think DeSantis has the same moxie without the hard edge. And I think that might be the winning formula.
Well, we'll find out. They haven't begun the pylon on him yet. So,
well, yeah, he'll take a beating. They'll go after him, especially if he gets near the nomination. Then the gloves will really come off.
Although he does have something Trump didn't have, which is he has establishment credentials. I mean, he went to Harvard, Yale, and was a lawyer in the U.S. Navy. So those are the three most elite institutions in the United States that I know of. And I forget if he went to Harvard and Yale. No, he went to Yale and Harvard Law. And then he was, but in other words, he's been at all the top schools that all these other people have been, which the other thing is like, how did he do that? I mean, that amazes me. Like, how can you get through that? But,
well, he probably wasn't revealing his political biases at the time. He was just concentrating on whatever the institution demanded. And by the way, I tell young conservatives that I say, don't fall on your sword early. Get the degree. And work for a boss who you might not agree with. Climb the ladder. There are times to die on the hill and times to be quiet. And you don't have to fight every battle. Doesn't mean you roll over, but pick your battles and pick the ones that are worth fighting. You may not always win them, but they should be worth fighting.
All right. Well, I think that's a very good line to conclude our interview on. It's been a pleasure, and I I have to say, you've certainly been graceful, as well, as far as I know, speaking the truth. So you've been not only talking the talk, but you've been walking the walk. I recommend this book. Now, where can people get this book?
RobertHKnight.com.
RobertHKnight.com. I'll put a link if they let this stay up. Otherwise, we'll put this on Rumble and a few other alternative websites, which I've noticed more people doing. You know, you watch a Neil Oliver, or you watch that British comedian Russell Brand, or this guy Fry. They have a YouTube channel. They say, but this part's going to go on Rumble, which is like, you know, what's that about? I mean, it's so weird. But in any case, there does seem to be another place you can put things, which is good, because in the free
book's
market,
on sale, by the way, quite a bit. I think
Oh.
I'm asking $3 for it or
$3.
something.
Well, that's worth it. I can
A
say
couple
as somebody
cases
who's-
of them, and what the heck, you know?
Yeah. No, I think it's also good that you're advocating, you know, a different approach. You know, I think it's an interesting thing. And I think back to the original Christians who were persecuted. And of course, Jews have been persecuted, but Christians have been persecuted throughout history too. And you may not see it
Have
as
that in common.
But if you know the history, for instance, of anti-clericalism in Mexico, which was anti-Catholic, they killed thousands of priests in Mexico, and in the
Communists have killed
anti-clerical
millions of Christians.
yeah, I mean it's just to the southern border, so it's not like it couldn't happen here, because it happened in Mexico in 100 years ago. You know, so. It's just incredible. Graham Greene
That's
wrote
why
about
we
it.
never stopped fighting it. You know, I got kids and grandkids. I don't want them growing up in an unfree America. It's unfree enough as it is. I'd like to see it freed up.
Well, that's good. If you can restore freedom, that would be a great thing. And
That's
God
the
bless
idea.
you, you know. And all right. Well, thank you. I'm going to stop the recording now.